Welcome back to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. For decades, our nation has had a standing policy that we don't deal with or accommodate terrorists. And yet accommodation is what we still have in New York City more than 7 years after terrorists knocked down the World Trade Towers. America's most famous skyline still has a gaping hole where the iconic images of capitalism and the American spirit once stood. Virtually no progress has been made in building up the site that Al-Qaeda destroyed. There is a transportation hub that is taking shape beneath ground, but the Freedom Tower project, the 4 buildings planned above ground, are still just a set of blueprints and artist projections. The building effort has been marked by bureaucratic bungling, engineering incompetence, a lack of planning, architectural flaws, and endless delays and skyrocketing projected costs. But it gets worse. Key tenants for the proposed Freedom Tower have pulled out because the rent is now slated to be among the most expensive in the world. You see, the occupied part of the building will only go up to about the 70th floor. The stuff above, including windmills, turbines, and an antenna-like thing, may be pretty as it reaches to 1,776 feet, but it has to be paid for by building tenants. And again, the number of tenants will be equivalent to a 70-story building, even though the overall cost they will have to share is for a 110-story high building. Joining us is Nicole, Gelinas, an editor with New York City Journal and a financial analyst who has written extensively about the proposed Freedom Tower. Nicole, I want to get to the projected cost issue in a second, but first of all, ground zero is hallowed ground. Why has this project been so badly bungled, and who's responsible?
Sure. Good evening, David. Well, the travesty of all of this started with the fact that this was misconceived from the start, starting with ex-Governor George Pataki. New York State essentially conspired, the political world conspired to try to reinvent the wheel as a square and then proceed to deny for more than half a decade that it wouldn't roll. This was not a difficult task. They made it into a very difficult task with all of the beauty pageants they had for architectural renderings and so forth. The job was to recreate the office space that was lost in the transit infrastructure and so on and so forth. And we wasted the biggest boom years that the city has ever seen dithering over this rather than just getting it done.
And by the way, I should point out that the artist sketches we're seeing now, that's not even for the proposed Freedom Tower. That's done by somebody else who has plans to rebuild a twin tower. They actually have very extensive blueprints and models. We're going to get to that in just a second. But as far as the cost, it's been my understanding that you don't build a building, an office tower, if you don't have any tenants. So when is the city or New York, how can they essentially move forward with this project as delayed as it's been, given these costs and given that nobody wants to rent there?
Sure. First of all, David, with the costs, unfortunately, there is no reasonable estimate today of how much this will cost. Almost a year ago, the state essentially admitted that all of its cost estimates, timetables, even what they could build in terms of how this new transit structure would fit into the rest of the site, whether the memorial was feasible, that all of these were just, they had to be thrown away, and they're still in the process of putting it back together. And as to your point about how do you build office buildings with no tenants, that is another major problem, particularly as the credit markets have completely fallen apart. Because what people don't realize is that the private landlord, Mr. Silverstein, he has federal tax credits to raise financing, but he has no guarantees of those financings. So in other words, he could have a very difficult time finding bondholders with no guarantee that there are going to be tenants in these buildings to repay him once these buildings are built. And that's going to be another big delay in this process, tacking on to 7 years of delays.
We're going to be talking tomorrow with somebody, this designer, who has the detailed plans to rebuild the Twin Towers. But I guess here's the key question. There is this sort of movement that's out there for people who say, you know what, if we want to reclaim that skyline, if we want to reclaim the American spirit that the terrorists took away, why not rebuild the Twin Towers? There is this plan to rebuild them taller, stronger, safer. Here's the key question. Is it too late to rebuild the Twin Towers in Lower Manhattan?
It certainly doesn't look like it's too late when you go down there and see how little has been done above ground. There is certainly plenty of opportunity to make sure that we are rebuilding as efficiently as possible, using scarce dollars wisely, and rebuilding something that the people and future tenants and the public actually want. So if there is still an opportunity here to make sure that we are going about this in a rational way, which we have not done so far, then I would certainly welcome that opportunity. And I hope that the new governor, he certainly doesn't want to become the third governor to fail at ground zero. So if there's an opportunity to rethink this fiasco here, I would suggest that he go for that.
I mean, there's so many people who describe the Freedom Tower, which I don't know why anybody would want to go into a building where you can only go as high as the 70th floor. I mean, who would want a windows on the world at the 70th floor? Because, I mean, everything above there is going to be unoccupied. But that's a whole other question. Is there anybody in the city or state government who recognizes what, for example, Donald Trump has said when he calls the Freedom Tower plan a piece of junk?
Well, there has been little city or state leadership here, unfortunately. When you look at the Freedom Tower in terms of the renderings, it's very clear that this was a building built by a committee of political factions trying to make everybody happy and making no one happy in the process. And the problem, of course, economically, in addition to the psychological factors of having a building there that possibly could just become a laughingstock, is that who is going to want to rent space in an impractically built, unattractive building? So this is certainly something we have to continue to think about as the climate for rebuilding and the opportunity for private financing here dries up, or has dried up.
Such a great point. Nicole Gelinas, who's an editor with New York City's City Journal and a financial analyst. And Nicole, thank you so much. Terrific reporting and fascinating story, an important one for all of us.